Silk does not tear easily. It stretches, it yields, it absorbs pressure with elegance, convincing the hand that presses it that resistance no longer exists. Iron behaves differently. Iron remembers every blow. It does not bend to persuasion. It waits, cold and patient, until pressure becomes fracture. History favors iron, but it is always silk that invites the test. An empire sits at a table lacquered with confidence. Brushes rest beside wine cups. Poems are composed about restraint, about balance, about the correct distance between desire and fulfillment. Outside the walls, no one is watching the walls anymore. They are assumed. The idea of defense has been outsourced to tradition. Violence has become an abstraction, something discussed in footnotes, remembered as a solved problem. Blood is theoretical. Pain is antique. The empire has not forgotten how to rule. It has forgotten why ruling was ever difficult. This is how stagnation disguises itself as civilization. It learns the language of refinement and calls it inevitability. It mistakes longevity for invincibility and elegance for strength. It builds a world so comfortable that the very concept of rupture begins to sound vulgar. The court becomes a museum of its own success. Every ritual is preserved. Every hierarchy is polished. Every failure is reframed as temporary, manageable, beneath concern. History watches without comment. History never interrupts confidence. Across a horizon with no walls and no metaphors, another society is being sharpened rather than softened. There are no archives here, no poets debating form, no belief that tomorrow will resemble today. There is wind. There is hunger. There is memory etched into muscle. Children learn balance on horseback before they learn speech. Law is not debated. It is enforced instantly, publicly, and without appeal. Mercy exists, but it is not sentimental. It is tactical. The steppe does not reward beauty. It rewards survival. And survival is a brutal editor. Weak customs disappear. Inefficient loyalties are discarded. Every habit is tested against cold, scarcity, and betrayal. Over time, this environment produces a peculiar kind of clarity. Violence is not glorified. It is normalized. Killing is not hatred. It is administration. When these two worlds first notice each other, they misunderstand the encounter completely. The Silk Empire looks north and sees disorder. Raids, dust, noise, a nuisance. Something to be managed with payments, treaties, or neglect. The Iron World looks south and sees abundance without vigilance. Wealth without calluses. Cities that assume permanence because they have existed long enough to forget contingency. Neither side believes it is inviting disaster. One believes it is superior. The other believes it is inevitable. This is the oldest mistake in imperial history. Civilizations assume collapse must arrive wearing unfamiliar clothes. They expect catastrophe to look alien. But ruin almost always arrives as a logical consequence of internal comfort. The force that breaks the door is rarely strange. It is summoned by what the house has become. The Southern Empire does not fall because it is ignorant. It falls because it is convinced it already knows the answer. Its military doctrines are beautiful in theory and obsolete in practice. Its alliances are clever and brittle. Its commanders are skilled at composing apologies for defeat before the battle has ended. Defense has become a matter of precedent rather than adaptation. Rivers are trusted like old friends. Walls are trusted like ancient gods. Trust replaces readiness. Inside the court, debates rage about the correct interpretation of harmony, while the definition of threat quietly changes. The empire still measures danger by scale and symbolism. It expects enemies to announce themselves properly, to conform to familiar shapes. What it does not understand is that the Iron World does not seek recognition. It seeks opportunity. And opportunity has a smell. It smells like complacency. The steppe notices something else. It notices fragmentation, multiple kingdoms circling one another with resentment, history unresolved, grievances carefully preserved. Old humiliations have not healed. They have been curated. Hatred is not loud. It is procedural. Borders exist less to protect than to remind. Every rival believes itself essential. None believes itself vulnerable. This is not balance. This is suspended collapse. The iron world excels at exploiting seams. It does not attack unity. It waits for division to present itself as strategy. It does not knock down gates. It convinces someone inside to open them. The first victories are small, almost forgettable. A raid here, a tribute there. Each success teaches the same lesson. Resistance is costly. Submission is efficient. Fear is faster than persuasion. Still, the Silk Empire reassures itself. These are border problems, seasonal disturbances, barbarian weather. Nothing structural, nothing worth reforming the center. After all, the center has worked for centuries. It must be right. Longevity has become proof. The empire confuses endurance with design. What the court cannot see is that the iron world is not improvising, it is preparing. While scholars refine language, the steppe refines logistics. While poets debate virtue, commanders debate supply lines. While officials argue jurisdiction, horsemen rehearse coordination across distances the Silk Empire has never needed to imagine. The iron world is not reacting, it is compressing. This compression produces a terrifying efficiency. Loyalty is rewarded instantly. Betrayal is eliminated absolutely. Identity is simplified into function. Every man knows his role. Every role serves movement. The society becomes a mechanism rather than a conversation. It is not pleasant, it is not stable, but it is extraordinarily effective at one thing: taking what others assume cannot be taken. The first real collision is not dramatic, it is instructional. Cities discover that walls designed to intimidate farmers do not intimidate people who sleep in the open. Armies trained to posture discover that posture dissolves under pressure. Negotiations framed around prestige fail when the other side values speed more than status. Every encounter teaches the same quiet lesson. This opponent is not impressed. Iron does not admire silk. It weighs it. It pulls at it. It tests the seams. And silk, for all its beauty, is designed to be worn, not to resist force. The empire begins to bleed in places it did not know were vital. Trade routes become liabilities. Rivers become corridors. Allies become liabilities disguised as solutions. Each patch creates two new tears. None of this feels sudden to history. It feels overdue. The paradox becomes visible only at the end. The more refined the empire became, the less prepared it was for crude efficiency. The more it invested in continuity, the more fragile that continuity grew. The silk did not fail because it was weak. It failed because it had optimized itself for a world that no longer existed. By the time the court understands that this is not a raid, but a replacement, the terms of survival have already changed. The iron world is no longer outside the walls. It is inside the logic of the system, learning it, using it, bending it. What began as contrast is becoming inversion. The saddle is approaching the throne. History does not mourn this moment. It records it. Comfort invited challenge. Elegance invited efficiency. Silk invited iron. This is not a tragedy. It is a rule. The steppe does not create leaders. It manufactures survivors, and occasionally mistakes one for a god. Birth offers no insulation here. Lineage is a rumor. Childhood is a stress test. Hunger is not an event. It is a curriculum. Out of this curriculum emerges a man who learns early that morality is a luxury item and loyalty is the only currency that appreciates under pressure. He is not raised to rule. He is forged to endure. He learns that trust must be enforced before it can be expected, that alliances are only as durable as the fear behind them, that mercy without consequence is merely delayed betrayal. When his family is shattered by poison politics and seasonal cruelty, he does not romanticize loss. He catalogs it. Every slight becomes a data point, every abandonment a lesson. The step teaches through subtraction. What remains is usable. Power on the step begins as motion. Whoever moves fastest gathers followers. Whoever hesitates loses them. This man moves by breaking patterns older than memory. He does not inherit tribes. He liquidates them. Ancient aristocracies are not negotiated with. They are erased. Bloodlines that once defined prestige are reduced to cautionary tales. Loyalty is redefined not as ancestry, but as performance. Serve well and rise. Fail and disappear. Equality is achieved through shared terror. This is not chaos. It is re-engineering. The old tribal world is dismantled and rebuilt into something colder, flatter, and brutally efficient. Kinship is replaced by command. Tradition is replaced by procedure. The emotional economy of honor is replaced by a transactional one. The steppe becomes a factory floor where humans are components, and survival is the quality control metric. To stabilize this machine, it requires software, not philosophy, not theology. A rule set that executes instantly and leaves no room for interpretation. This is where law appears, not as justice, but as infrastructure. The yasa is not written to resolve disputes. It is written to prevent hesitation. It is a checklist for obedience, elevated into something sacred so no one mistakes it for optional. The rules are simple and merciless. Cowardice is death. Abandoning a comrade is death. Stealing from within the group is death. Disobedience is death. There are no appeals because appeals slow momentum. There are no mitigating circumstances because nuance creates loopholes. The yasa is not interested in fairness. It is interested in reliability. In this system, violence becomes administrative. Punishment is not emotional. It is procedural. Executions are not spectacles of rage, but demonstrations of consistency. The message is clear and endlessly reinforced. The machine works because everyone understands the cost of jamming it. This clarity produces something rare in human organizations. Predictability. Every man knows where he stands. Advancement is visible. Failure is terminal. There is no bureaucratic fog to hide incompetence. There is no inherited immunity. Even proximity to the center offers no protection. The law applies upward as ruthlessly as it applies downward. The leader survives not because he is gentle, but because he is useful. The steppe army that emerges from this foundry is not large by civilized standards. It does not need to be. It is fast, disciplined, and emotionally simplified. Soldiers do not fight for ideology. They fight because the system gives them food, status, and survival, and because deviation means extinction. Motivation is not inspired, it is engineered. Coordination becomes the true weapon. Units move like limbs rather than mobs. Commands are short, signals are redundant. Retreat is not shameful if ordered. Advance is mandatory if commanded. Individual bravery is less valued than collective precision. The army behaves less like a horde and more like a distributed organism. This organism discovers something the settled world has forgotten. Fortifications are psychological constructs. They work best on people who believe walls have meaning. To the steppe mind, a wall is simply a delay. A city is not a sacred space. It is a warehouse. Resistance is not heroic. It is inefficient. When the machine tests itself against its first real targets, the results are horrifyingly consistent. Cities that submit are catalogued, taxed, and left intact. Cities that resist are erased, not conquered, erased. The distinction matters. Erasure is not revenge, it is instruction. News travels faster than armies. Fear outruns cavalry. This policy is not sadism, it is logistics. Annihilation reduces future resistance. Mercy is extended strategically, not emotionally. The machine does not hate its enemies. It does not need to. Hatred is inefficient. Fear is scalable. As victories accumulate, something dangerous begins to happen. Success feeds ambition, and ambition requires justification. The machine acquires myth. The leader becomes more than an organizer. He becomes inevitable. The sky itself is invoked, not because the leader believes it, but because it simplifies loyalty. If victory is ordained, then resistance is treason against the universe. This belief is useful. It keeps commanders aligned. It discourages fragmentation. It gives cosmic cover to a system that otherwise admits it is nothing more than optimized violence. The myth spreads faster than the truth because the truth is uncomfortable. The truth is that this empire is a weapon without a sheath. The problem with weapons is that they are designed for use, not storage. The machine knows how to move, how to strike, how to punish. It does not know how to wait. It does not know how to govern stillness. Every solution it possesses involves motion. When motion stops, the system grows restless. This flaw is invisible during expansion. As long as there are new targets, new territories, new enemies, the machine remains stable. Success masks limitation. The leader's genius is undeniable, but it is narrowly focused. He has mastered destruction as an art form. Construction does not interest him. Maintenance bores him. Administration is beneath his contempt. He leaves behind a blueprint that is brilliant and incomplete. The Yasa can command an army. It cannot run an economy. It can enforce loyalty among warriors. It cannot manage farmers. It can terrorize cities into silence. It cannot persuade them to produce surplus willingly. What the steppe has created is the most effective conquest engine the world has ever seen, powered by rules that treat humans as replaceable parts. It is optimized for shock, speed, and obedience. It is not optimized for longevity. It does not age well. By the time this machine turns its attention southward toward wealth rather than survival, the flaw is already embedded. The system assumes that everything worth having can be taken. It has no category for things that must be sustained. It assumes fear can substitute for consent indefinitely. It cannot imagine a world where violence stops paying dividends. The founder does not live to see the consequences. He dies as he lived, in motion, during annihilation, satisfied that the machine works. And it does work. Perfectly. Too perfectly. He leaves behind sons and grandsons who inherit not a state, but a process. They are handed a sword with no instructions for setting it down. The steppe has done its work. It has forged iron where silk once believed itself sufficient. But iron corrodes when left exposed, and the Yasa, flawless as an operating system for conquest, has no update for peace. The most dangerous alliances are formed not out of trust, but out of memory. Memory remembers pain selectively. It sharpens humiliation and blurs consequence. The Southern court remembers only one thing with perfect clarity. A century earlier, it had been driven south by northern conquerors who wore foreign boots and demanded submission. That wound never healed. It fermented. By the time the Iron Riders appeared again on the horizon, the court no longer evaluated danger. It evaluated revenge. To the south, the Northern Dynasty looked like the real enemy. It occupied ancestral lands. It controlled the old capitals. It stood as a living reminder of disgrace. The steppe riders, by contrast, looked temporary. Nomads always did. They came, they raided, They left. They had no roots, no cities worth holding, no culture worth fearing. The court mistook mobility for impermanence and brutality for lack of ambition. This misreading would be fatal. Between North and South sat a buffer that had quietly done its job for generations. The Northern Dynasty absorbed pressure, bled in wars, and kept the steppes at arm's length. It was resented, hated, and despised. But it was also useful. Buffers always are until hatred convinces someone they are optional. The Iron Machine understood buffers perfectly. It did not see the Northern Dynasty as a civilization. It saw it as insulation. And insulation, once removed, exposes everything beneath. The steppe did not need to destroy the Southern Empire immediately. It only needed to persuade it to remove its own shield. The offer was simple and elegant: an alliance, temporary, mutually beneficial. The North would fall. The South would reclaim lost lands. The steppe would receive assistance, supplies, and legitimacy. It was framed as strategy. It was, in truth, assisted suicide. The Southern court accepted eagerly. Hatred made the arithmetic easy. The Northern Dynasty was weakened by its own compromises, softened by the culture it ruled, distracted by internal decay. Against the Iron Riders alone, it might have endured longer. Against a coordinated assault, it collapsed with humiliating speed. The campaigns were brutal and methodical. Cities that resisted were dismantled piece by piece. Those that surrendered were stripped of meaning. Siege warfare became an industry. Starvation replaced heroism. The Iron Machine learned how to crack walls designed by engineers who had never imagined an enemy that did not fear time. When the final northern capital fell, the southern armies marched into the ruins as if into a restored inheritance. Banners were raised. Rituals were performed. Officials wrote proclamations celebrating the recovery of ancestral territory. They congratulated themselves on their foresight. They had been clever. They had used the barbarians against each other. They believed they had controlled the chaos. History rarely allows celebrations to finish. What the court did not notice was the silence behind them. The buffer was gone, the insulation removed. The North no longer absorbed pressure. It transmitted it. The steppe riders did not withdraw. They repositioned. The alliance had served its purpose. The wolf had been invited into the yard and fed until the dog was dead. At this moment, the Iron Machine faced a new problem. It had eliminated its primary obstacle, but it had also absorbed a territory too large to ignore. Expansion creates gravity. Conquered lands pull administration toward them, whether invited or not. The machine began to slow, not from resistance, but from mass. This exposed a second flaw, subtler than violence: succession. On the steppe, inheritance is not vertical, it is horizontal. Land is pasture. Pasture is divided. Authority is shared until it isn't. The death of the founder did not bring unity. It brought multiplication. Territories were apportioned. Command was distributed. Loyalty fragmented along bloodlines. From this division emerged factions that did not yet understand they were enemies. One side clung to motion. Cities were prisons. Farmers were resources to be extracted and abandoned. The empire existed to fuel further conquest. Stopping meant decay. The other side had tasted something intoxicating: stability, revenue, cities that did not burn, bureaucrats who could make chaos predictable. The Southern Alliance had accelerated this divide. By dragging the Iron Machine into the business of governance, it forced a question the machine was not designed to answer. Was this a weapon, or was it becoming a state? The death of the Northern Dynasty crystallized the debate. There were no more obvious enemies to the North. The South remained, wealthy and intact. Some argued it should be harvested and left to rot. Others saw something more valuable: control rather than destruction, taxation rather than plunder, continuity rather than smoke. This argument did not remain theoretical. It attached itself to blood. Brothers, sons, grandsons, each conquest added not just territory, but ambition. Each territory demanded a different answer to the same question. What now? The southern court watched these developments with growing unease. It sensed the shift too late. The barbarians were no longer raiders. They were administrators in training. They learned the names of rivers. They learned where grain moved. They learned which officials could be bribed and which could be ignored. They learned the language of rule. Attempts to restore the old buffer were laughable. There was no buffer left to restore. The North had been transformed into an extension of the iron machine. Roads were mapped, garrisons established. Information flowed north to south with alarming efficiency. What had once been frontier became corridor. The alliance had achieved its stated goal. The hated Northern Dynasty was gone, but alliances do not disappear when objectives are met. They decay into dependencies. The Southern Empire had tied its security to a force that did not recognize gratitude as a binding concept. What followed was a period of denial. The court convinced itself that accommodation was still possible. Tribute could buy time. Diplomacy could manage ambition. Ritual superiority could still impress. The iron machine observed these gestures with professional detachment. It accepted gifts. It studied ceremonies. It learned. This was not deception. It was absorption. By the time the Southern Court understood that the alliance had inverted the balance of power permanently, the strategic options were already gone. Rivers that once served as moats were now supply lines. Fortresses designed to deter one enemy faced another that had no interest in being deterred. The buffer had not merely died. It had been repurposed. The shield had become a blade. History records this moment without drama. It notes that the Southern Empire assisted in its own exposure. That hatred proved more persuasive than caution. That memory of humiliation outweighed imagination of consequence. The alliance with wolves did exactly what alliances with wolves always do. It solved yesterday's problem by creating tomorrow's catastrophe. And when the wolves finally turned their attention south, they did not arrive as strangers. They arrived as former partners who had already memorized the house. An empire can survive brutality. It can even survive incompetence. What it rarely survives is inheritance without design. The moment conquest pauses, ownership begins. And ownership is where the steppe tradition quietly arms itself with explosives. On the grasslands, land is not territory. It is motion. It is grazing distance, seasonal rhythm, an understanding that nothing stays still long enough to be fenced. Power follows the same logic. It is shared because it must move. When a patriarch dies, the world does not crown a replacement. It fractures. Each son takes a portion, not because this is efficient, but because this is how survival once worked. Division prevents extinction. It also guarantees rivalry. This custom is not a flaw in a nomadic context. It is an adaptation. It prevents stagnation. It ensures constant pressure outward. But when applied to an empire that has stopped expanding at the edges and started thickening at the center, it becomes shrapnel. The blast is delayed, but it is inevitable. The conquered world expects a crown. The steppe offers a pasture map. After the founder's death, the empire does not collapse. That would be merciful. Instead, it enters a phase of distributed ambition. Sons and grandsons inherit not just land, but entitlement. Each believes the conquest was meant for him. Each carries the same story of destiny, filtered through personal grievance. Unity becomes ceremonial. Loyalty becomes conditional. The empire remains intact on maps while splintering in behavior. Out of this process emerged the great Ulis, vast domains ruled by relatives who share blood but not patience. To the west, a horde that looks toward Europe. In the center, another that eyes the Silk Road. In the east, the portion that includes the richest prize of all, North China. Each domain claims legitimacy. Each claims continuity. Each quietly prepares for independence. This fragmentation does not feel like rebellion. It feels like administration. Letters are exchanged. Gifts are sent. Titles are affirmed. The rituals of unity continue even as trust evaporates. Everyone agrees to the fiction because the fiction is useful. It keeps the peace long enough to build leverage. Inside the elite, a deeper split hardens. It is not geographical. It is philosophical. One faction clings to the steppe as identity. Cities are traps. Walls are coffins. Farmers are liabilities who eat time and demand protection. To these men, conquest is the only honest activity. Stopping means rot. Settling means surrender. The other faction has tasted something else: predictability, surplus. Administrators who can turn land into revenue without burning it first. They have slept indoors long enough to appreciate roofs. They have watched markets function and realized that fear, while effective, is inefficient. These men are accused of softness by their peers. They return the accusation quietly. Barbarism, they argue, is expensive. Neither side is wrong. They are simply optimized for different worlds. This disagreement does not announce itself as ideology. It appears as preference. Where to camp, how long to stay, whether to rebuild a city or move on, whether to kill an official or keep him. Each decision feels small. Together, they define the future. The steppe purists see administration as contamination. Every clerk hired is a warrior dulled. Every city spared is momentum lost. They believe the empire's strength lies in remaining ungovernable. The moment it learns to manage itself, it will forget how to fight. The pragmatists see the opposite. Endless motion is wasteful. Conquest without consolidation is theft without profit. The real victory, they argue, is not seizing gold, but extracting it repeatedly. Cities are not prisons, they are engines. These debates would remain academic if not for succession. Every death at the top reopens the argument. Every accession is contested not just by rivals, but by definitions of what the empire is supposed to be. The throne becomes less a seat and more a referendum. The empire's size amplifies the problem. Communication lags. Armies operate semi-autonomously. Regional commanders grow accustomed to independence. Orders arrive late or not at all. Loyalty becomes personal rather than institutional. Men follow leaders who feed them, not distant cousins who claim cosmic favor. This creates a paradox. The empire is strongest militarily precisely when it is weakest politically. No external enemy can match its force. Internally, every decision feels provisional. Stability exists, but it is thin, stretched across too much territory with too little agreement. The conquered populations observe this with interest. They have seen this pattern before. Strong rulers unify, weak successors quarrel. Foreign elites fight among themselves while locals wait. Waiting is a skill refined over centuries. The administrative apparatus begins to creak. Different regions adopt different practices. Taxes are collected inconsistently. Military obligations vary by allegiance. Justice is applied unevenly, depending on which faction controls a given area. The empire does not break, it loses coherence. Attempts to formalize succession only worsen matters. Any rule clear enough to enforce is rejected by those it excludes. Any compromise broad enough to satisfy all sides is meaningless. Every solution becomes another grievance. In this environment, personalities matter more than institutions. Charismatic commanders accumulate followings. Competent administrators gain influence disproportionate to their rank. Marriages become political weapons. Rumors replace policy. The court becomes a marketplace of favors traded for future support. This is the moment when conquest begins to turn inward. Not openly, not yet, but the targets subtly change. Instead of cities, rivals are besieged. Instead of enemies, cousins are neutralized. The skills honed on the battlefield are repurposed for succession disputes. The empire eats its own tail, slowly, politely. The irony is exquisite. The same system that made the empire unbeatable now ensures it cannot decide what to do with itself. The law that enforces obedience cannot adjudicate inheritance. The culture that rewards strength cannot define legitimacy beyond force. Every claimant is strong. Every claimant has an army. The argument never ends. Meanwhile, the conquered lands continue to demand attention. Canals silt. Granaries require maintenance. Merchants need protection. Farmers need incentives. None of this excites the steppe imagination. These tasks produce no glory. They do not move. They sit and wait. The empire begins to experience friction. Movement slows. Decisions stack. Resources are wasted duplicating authority. The cost of unity rises while its benefits feel abstract. For the first time, expansion no longer solves internal problems. It postpones them. The fracture is not yet a collapse. It is a condition, a hairline crack running through everything. Invisible from a distance, obvious up close, and hovering over all of it is a single unanswered question that no law, no tradition, and no victory can settle. Is this empire a machine designed to move forever, or has it accidentally become a state that must learn how to stand still? The shrapnel is already embedded. It will detonate the moment stillness becomes unavoidable. The death of a ruler is supposed to clarify power. In this empire, it did the opposite. It turned uncertainty into a weapon and handed it to everyone at once. The campaign was meant to be routine. Another fortress. Another lesson delivered by siege and starvation. The southern world had already begun to crack, and the iron machine was advancing with the patience of something that had never been forced to rush. Then, without drama, without spectacle, the center failed. The supreme commander fell not in a cavalry charge, not beneath banners, but quietly, ignobly, somewhere between heat, disease, and accident. The most powerful man alive died the way administrators die. Unexpectedly, inconveniently, off script. For an empire built on inevitability, this was catastrophic. News traveled faster than orders, faster than explanations, faster than plans. The empire did not pause. It fractured mid-stride. Armies stopped advancing and began calculating. Courtiers stopped obeying and began choosing. The question was no longer who would win the next war, but who would decide what winning even meant. Two brothers heard the same message and understood it as an accusation. One sat in the old heart of the world, surrounded by grasslands, traditions, and men who believed motion itself was sacred. He was the guardian of origins, the custodian of purity. He had stayed close to the steppe not out of nostalgia, but out of conviction. To him, cities were infections. Comfort was corrosion. The empire existed to dominate, not to adapt. He wore the dust of the ancestors like armor and spoke of loyalty as if it were a blood type. The other brother was elsewhere, already deep inside the machinery of civilization. He lived among walls, markets, and ledgers. He listened to advisors who spoke in the language of yield rather than glory. He had learned to sit still long enough to understand how stillness could be weaponized. He was already suspect. He had gone native without asking permission. Their rivalry was not personal, it was structural. The empire had delayed this confrontation for years by expanding outward. Expansion disguises disagreement. As long as everyone is busy conquering, nobody has to define what comes after. The death of the supreme ruler removed that distraction. The empire was forced to look at itself without momentum. It did not like what it saw. The brother of the steppe moved first, not with armies, but with legitimacy. He invoked tradition. He gathered the old guard. He positioned himself as the last unbroken line between the present and the founder's will. His claim was simple. The empire must remain what it was designed to be: a force, a storm. Anything else was betrayal. The brother of the cities responded differently. He did not challenge tradition directly. He bypassed it. He understood something his rival did not. Legitimacy is not inherited. It is financed. He had access to resources the steppe could not produce: grain, tax revenue, labor, infrastructure, the slow, boring power of settled wealth. While his brother counted warriors, he counted supply lines. Civil war did not announce itself as war. It arrived as overlapping commands, conflicting proclamations, and sudden shortages. Armies found themselves waiting for orders that never came. Officials received contradictory instructions and chose whichever came with protection. The empire's unity became theoretical. The conflict escalated quietly. One side relied on speed and intimidation. The other relied on endurance. The steppe forces struck hard but could not stay long. The city-based faction absorbed blows and replenished. This was not a contest of courage. It was a contest of logistics. Over time, the advantage became obvious. The steppe could conquer cities, but it could not feed an empire indefinitely from pastures. Horses do not print receipts. The city faction, despised for its softness, proved something deeply offensive to the old guard. It worked. The brother of the steppe lost not because he was weak, but because his worldview was incomplete. He understood how to win battles. He did not understand how to win time. His supporters fought fiercely, but they fought hungry. Their loyalty was unquestioned, but their supplies were not infinite. Eventually, ideology collided with arithmetic. The brother of the cities emerged victorious, but victory came at a cost no one could miss. He had won an internal war using the resources of a conquered civilization. The implications were unmistakable. The empire had chosen administration over purity, stillness over motion, calculation over instinct. This choice did not end debate. It crystallized it. To the traditionalists, the victor was no longer fully legitimate. He had defeated his own kin by leaning on the tools of the conquered. He ruled, yes, but as something contaminated. To the pragmatists, the victory proved their point. The empire could not survive on memory and violence alone. It needed structure. The new ruler stood between these judgments with no room to retreat. He could not return to the steppe without abandoning the wealth that had secured his throne. He could not fully embrace the steppe worldview without dismantling the system that kept him alive. He was suspended between two definitions of power, accepted by neither completely. The war for the throne had been a war for the soul of the empire, and the result was not resolution. It was transformation under duress. Externally, nothing seemed to change. Campaigns continued. Orders were issued. Tribute flowed. Internally, everything had shifted. The precedent was set. Resources trumped lineage. Administration trumped tradition. The empire had crossed a line it could not uncross. This victory forced a new question, one far more dangerous than the last. If the empire was no longer purely of the steppe, then what was it? A conqueror ruling a civilization, or a civilization ruled by conquerors pretending not to change? The ruler understood the risk. He moved carefully. He preserved symbols. He honored rituals. He spoke the language of tradition even as he quietly hollowed it out. He was not trying to destroy the old identity. He was trying to repurpose it. This balancing act required constant vigilance. Every appointment was political. Every reform was suspect. Every accommodation risked mutiny. The court became a theater of reassurance. Traditionalists were praised. Administrators were empowered discreetly. Contradictions were papered over with ceremony. The conquered populations watched with cautious interest. They had learned to recognize this phase, the moment when conquerors begin to argue about how to rule rather than whether they should. This was the opening they had waited for, though they did not yet act. For now, the empire held. The armies obeyed. The borders remained intact. But the cost of cohesion had increased permanently. Unity was no longer automatic. It had to be purchased repeatedly, with concessions, favors, and compromises. The ruler had won the throne. He had not solved the problem of succession. He had only postponed it and made it more expensive. The empire moved forward again, but it moved differently. Slower, heavier, more self-aware. The iron machine was learning to wear silk, and silk, while elegant, restricts movement. The brothers had fought. The steppe had lost the argument. The city had won the war, and the empire, caught between them, had become something new and profoundly unstable. Legitimacy is the most valuable resource an empire can steal because it regenerates itself. Gold runs out, armies age, fear dulls. But legitimacy, once accepted, recruits the conquered into maintaining their own submission. It convinces people to cooperate with the force that defeated them. It turns occupation into administration. This ruler understood that truth with unsettling clarity. He did not announce a conquest. He announced a correction. The iron throne he now sat upon was unstable. It rested on victory, not consent. Victory had brought him territory, but territory alone does not obey. It resists quietly. It withholds effort. It waits. The ruler had won an internal civil war, using the wealth of a conquered civilization, and everyone knew it. His Mongol peers saw contamination. His Chinese subjects saw an interlude. Neither saw permanence. Permanence required a theft far greater than land. He did not look north for answers. He looked inward, into the symbolic machinery of the civilization he ruled. He studied how power was explained rather than how it was enforced. He learned that Chinese dynasties did not justify themselves by conquest. They justified themselves by alignment. Heaven, earth, and man arranged in harmony. When order existed, heaven approved. When chaos appeared, heaven withdrew its favor. This was not theology. It was political physics. So he did something audacious. He claimed heaven, not as a conqueror, as an heir. When he declared a new dynasty, he did not choose a name from the steppe, from blood, from clan, or from victory. He reached into the philosophical core of his subjects and extracted a term saturated with inevitability. Origin, beginning. The primal force that generates all things. The declaration was surgical. It implied continuity rather than rupture. This was not a foreign regime. This was the next chapter in a story heaven itself was telling. This was not assimilation. It was appropriation. In one move, he reframed the conquest as succession. The sword faded into the background. The brush stepped forward. Ritual replaced shock. Calendars were reset. Titles were reassigned. Bureaucrats were summoned, evaluated, and employed. The ruler wrapped himself in the grammar of legitimacy so completely that resistance now sounded like heresy. He reinforced the declaration physically. He did not rule from the grasslands. He did not commute between worlds. He planted himself in stone. On the ruins of a fallen northern capital, he built a city designed not for mobility, but for permanence. Grids, avenues, palaces, calibrated to cosmic geometry. A capital that announced without words that movement had ended. The city was not merely administrative, it was performative. Every gate aligned with ritual. Every courtyard staged authority. The architecture whispered the same message in every direction. This rule is normal. This rule is ordered. This rule is here to stay. For the Mongol elite, this was deeply unsettling. The ruler had not simply compromised, he had crossed a line. Cities were supposed to be exploited, not inhabited. Walls were supposed to be broken, not commissioned. He was not ruling China from the saddle. He was ruling it from a throne. Suspicion spread quietly. He was still obeyed, but no longer trusted. Traditionalists saw betrayal dressed as sophistication. The empire had been built on movement, and now its leader was anchored. Anchors rust. For the Chinese elite, the response was colder. They recognized the performance immediately. They had seen it before. Foreign dynasties always learned the script eventually. The question was not whether the ruler spoke the language correctly, but whether heaven would accept the accent. They complied. They advised. They waited. The ruler knew he could not rely on sentiment. He relied on structure. He reorganized administration, centralized taxation, and standardized procedure. He preserved Mongol privilege while quietly embedding Chinese systems beneath it. The surface remained foreign. The skeleton became familiar. This hybrid was intentional. He was not trying to become Chinese. He was trying to make China govern him. If the system worked, it would outlast his identity. That was the gamble. But legitimacy, once stolen, demands maintenance. Heaven is generous, but it is not patient. To keep the mandate, order must be visible. Grain must move. Roads must function. Floods must be contained. The ruler had inherited not just symbols, but responsibilities. He understood the risk. He also understood the alternative. Rule without legitimacy required endless terror. Terror exhausted resources and created enemies faster than it eliminated them. The mandate offered efficiency. It turned obedience into habit. The declaration changed the nature of resistance. Rebellion was no longer defiance against occupiers. It became treason against cosmic order. The rhetoric shifted. Compliance increased. Silence deepened. But silence is not consent. It is storage. By declaring the dynasty, the ruler solved one problem and created several others. He had anchored the empire, but anchoring makes storms more dangerous. He had borrowed legitimacy, but borrowed legitimacy accrues interest. He had become the son of heaven, but heaven, unlike the steppe, keeps records. The iron machine had been dressed in silk. It looked impressive. It felt convincing. But beneath the fabric, the old mechanisms still moved, grinding against systems they were never designed to fit. The theft was complete. The consequences would take time. Walls fail long before they fall. They fail the moment the world outside learns how patient it must be. For decades, the Southern Empire trusted its rivers the way other states trusted fortresses. Water was defense. Distance was deterrence. Time was an ally. This belief had survived countless raids and smaller wars. It had hardened into doctrine, and doctrine, once hardened, becomes brittle. The fortress city sat astride the arteries of the South like a clenched fist. It guarded the passage between North and South, land and river, movement and stasis. As long as it held, the Southern world could pretend the future was negotiable. Its walls were thick, its supplies ample, its defenders confident that siege was an outdated art, something practiced by men who did not understand logistics or climate. The besiegers understood both. They did not rush. They did not assault blindly. They waited. They measured. They sealed routes, not with noise, but with arithmetic. Every boat intercepted was a subtraction. Every field denied was a countdown. The siege was not dramatic. It was administrative. The defenders watched their granaries empty at the speed of policy. What broke the city was not hunger alone. It was the realization that no relief was coming. The alliances that had once promised support now hesitated. Commanders argued. Couriers vanished. The river that had once protected the city became a corridor for the enemy's machines. Weapons appeared that turned walls into suggestions. The future arrived quietly, carried on barges. When the city finally opened, it did not collapse. It was dismantled. Its fall did not signal a single defeat. It signaled the end of a strategy. The river defense, the layered fortifications, the belief in delay as victory, all of it drained away with the water. From that moment, the South was no longer a fortified landscape. It was an exposed system. The conquerors moved with unsettling confidence. Cities fell in sequence, not because they were weak, but because they now understood resistance was symbolic. Governors surrendered preemptively. Garrisons melted into crowds. The bureaucracy continued to function, transferring allegiance with professional efficiency. The empire did not explode. It inverted. At the center, the court reacted as courts always do when faced with structural failure. It debated tone. It adjusted rituals. It issued proclamations about loyalty and virtue while territory vanished between paragraphs. The emperor became smaller as the crisis grew larger. Power retreated into ceremony. The final act did not take place on land. It took place at sea, where symbols drowned quickly. What remained of the dynasty gathered its remnants onto ships. Courtiers, soldiers, scribes, musicians, children. The court transformed into a floating archive, carrying with it seals, texts, and the idea that legitimacy could be preserved through proximity. If the throne could not stand on earth, perhaps it could survive on water. The fleet was vast and desperate, packed so tightly that privacy ceased to exist. Hierarchy flattened under panic. Ritual continued only because it was all the court had left. The sea offered no walls, no rivers to hide behind. It offered only direction, and there was nowhere left to go. The enemy did not hurry. They encircled. They blocked escape routes with the same calm precision they had used on land. The final confrontation was less a battle than an inevitability. Arrows flew. Ships burned. The water filled with debris and bodies. Command dissolved into instinct. At the center of this chaos stood the last embodiment of the dynasty's claim to order. A child emperor, too young to understand why the world had narrowed so completely. Around him clustered men who had spent their lives believing in continuity. They faced a choice that was not strategic, but symbolic. Capture meant erasure. Survival meant transformation into something unrecognizable. The court chose neither. It chose an ending that preserved meaning at the cost of life. One man stepped forward, carrying the last sovereign like an artifact. He did not shout. He did not plead. He performed the final ritual with absolute clarity. He stepped into the water. The sea closed over them both. What followed was not surrender. It was imitation. Officials, soldiers, attendants followed in waves, leaping into the same fate. Not because it was ordered, but because it was coherent. The dynasty ended not with a signature, but with silence. The water absorbed everything. Banners, crowns, titles. History registered the moment without commentary. A dynasty that had defined itself through refinement chose dissolution over adaptation. It preserved its dignity by eliminating itself. For the conquerors, the moment was instructive. They had won the most complete victory imaginable. All under heaven lay beneath them. There was no rival left to absorb blame or buffer resentment. The entire weight of governance now rested on their shoulders. The irony was immediate. Victory removed the last excuse. There would be no more inherited enemies to justify failure, no more external threats to explain disorder. The empire had achieved total dominance, and in doing so, it had inherited total responsibility. The sea was calm again. The ships drifted. The campaign ended. On land, a new order settled in, heavy and unfamiliar. The conquerors had broken the last wall. What remained was not resistance, but expectation. Grain needed to move. Taxes needed to be collected. Rivers needed management. People needed reasons to cooperate. The dynasty had drowned itself to preserve meaning. The victors stood on the shore, holding power without opposition. This was the moment when conquest ended and rule began. And rule, unlike war, offers no clean endings. Empires are accustomed to believing that resistance has a face: a king, a general, a city wall tall enough to insult the sky. The moment an empire learns that resistance can be invisible, indifferent, and atmospheric, it begins to age rapidly. The conqueror had reached a dangerous point in his career. He had inherited total victory on land. Rivers obeyed. Cities complied. The calendar ran on his authority. This is the stage where ambition stops asking what is possible and starts demanding what is appropriate. The horizon shrinks not because the world is smaller, but because the ruler has run out of rivals worthy of explanation. Across the water lay an island that did not fit the pattern. No tributary etiquette, no ritual submission, no apology for independence. Messages were sent and returned unopened, or returned with silence that carried the faintest hint of insult. The island's warriors did not recognize inevitability. They recognized intrusion. The conqueror interpreted this not as defiance, but as error. Errors could be corrected. The first fleet was assembled with confidence rather than care. Soldiers from different worlds were pressed together onto ships designed by committee and urgency. Horsemen were told to become sailors. Archers were told the sea would behave like a field. Commanders were told the weight of empire would carry them through unfamiliar water. It was a land empire attempting to breathe salt. When the armada reached the shore, the confrontation was immediately awkward. The defenders did not line up to be overwhelmed. They emerged individually, challenging invaders one by one, breaking formation with personal violence that ignored the logic of mass tactics. The conquerors, trained to move as systems, found themselves entangled in encounters that refused to scale. Then the weather intervened. It did not announce itself. It did not negotiate. It did not recognize rank or destiny. It arrived with the indifference of a force that has never needed justification. Wind tore at anchors. Waves broke ships against each other. The fleet scattered, confused, exhausted, and abruptly aware that conquest had been outsourced to physics. The retreat was humiliating but survivable. The conqueror did not read it as a warning. He read it as an anomaly. This was his mistake. Failure, to a mind trained in inevitability, can only mean insufficient commitment. The solution was not restraint. It was scale. The second invasion would be larger, heavier, undeniable. If the sea had rejected him once, it would be forced to comply under sufficient mass. Shipyards worked without rest. Forests vanished into keels and masts. Administrators squeezed provinces to fund construction. The empire strained not under resistance, but under preparation. The fleet that emerged was a floating monument to confidence. Thousands of ships, tens of thousands of men. Enough force, it was believed, to frighten the ocean itself. The armada moved with ceremony. This was not a raid. It was an erasure scheduled in advance. For weeks, the invasion ground forward. Landings were made, fortifications tested. Casualties mounted but remained acceptable. The defenders bled and did not break. The conquerors pressed on, convinced that persistence itself was victory. The sea remained quiet. Too quiet. Then it spoke. The storm did not arrive as punishment. It arrived as correction. Winds rose with sudden coherence, as if the sky had been waiting for sufficient arrogance. Waves lifted ships and dropped them without malice. Anchors snapped. Hulls collided. Fleets dissolved into debris fields. The water became a factory for wreckage. This time there was no retreat. There was nothing to retreat with. Ships broke apart faster than orders could be issued. Soldiers drowned inside armor that had conquered continents. Supplies vanished. Command disappeared. The armada was not defeated. It was erased by an opponent that could not be negotiated with or threatened. Survivors washed ashore not as conquerors, but as evidence. The island absorbed them without ceremony. The conqueror did not rage publicly. He did something more dangerous. He rationalized. The weather was blamed. The captains were blamed. The soldiers were blamed. Anything but the assumption itself. Empires are slow to accept that some borders are not defended by men. This realization spread quietly through the elite. The world had pushed back, not with armies, but with constraints. The ocean had enforced a rule the steppe had never needed to learn. Control ends where environment begins. The psychological damage was greater than the material loss. The empire had always believed that scale was a solution. If something resisted, more force would fix it. The storm demonstrated a limit that could not be overcome by accumulation. The conqueror's aura dimmed, not because he lost ships, but because he lost inevitability. This was the first time heaven had declined to endorse expansion. The failure changed the calculus of ambition. Expansion no longer felt like destiny. It felt like risk. The court grew cautious in ways it had never been before. Advisors who had whispered restraint gained influence. Generals accustomed to certainty began to hedge their recommendations. The empire did not retreat. It recalibrated. The irony was sharp. The greatest land empire in history had been checked by water and wind. The conquerors who had mastered distance, coordination, and terror had encountered a force immune to discipline. The lesson was obvious and deeply offensive. Not everything could be conquered. Some things could only be respected. The island did not celebrate. It did not pursue. It simply remained unconquered. That fact alone reshaped the mental map of the world. The empire was no longer infinite. It had edges that were not lines but conditions. The conqueror turned away from the sea with reluctance. His ambition did not diminish. It redirected. If the ocean refused him, the jungle would be taught obedience. If the storm could not be commanded, perhaps heat and disease could be bullied into submission. History noted the shift without commentary. The first refusal had been issued. It would not be the last. Weather had spoken. The empire had heard, but not yet understood. The jungle does not announce resistance. It absorbs it. Armies enter believing they will impose order and discover instead that order has been dissolved into humidity, insects, and silence. The steppe had conquered deserts, plains, and stone. It had never learned how to fight a landscape that refused to be read. Southward lay a kingdom that looked insignificant on maps and catastrophic in practice. No grand walls, no imperial capitals worth preserving. No appetite for heroic confrontation. The land itself seemed uninterested in spectacle. Rice fields replaced parade grounds. Rivers replaced roads. Forests closed ranks behind every march. The conqueror approached this place with the confidence of someone who believed he had already solved war. Submission was demanded. Submission was declined with a politeness that bordered on mockery. This was not rebellion. It was refusal without drama. The first invasion moved quickly and failed quickly. The steppe machine advanced, captured empty spaces, and declared victory over absence. Cities were entered and found hollow. Storehouses were bare. Officials had vanished. What should have been triumph felt like looting an evacuated theater. The army marched deeper and grew weaker with every step. Heat replaced momentum. Armor became ballast. Horses sickened. Supply lines stretched and frayed. The enemy did not appear because it did not need to. Hunger did the work more efficiently. When attacks came, they came from nowhere, struck quickly, and dissolved back into green anonymity. The conquerors withdrew with losses they could explain, but not prevent. They learned nothing except contempt. The second invasion was larger, louder, and more determined to prove the first an aberration. Better generals were assigned, more troops committed. The logic was familiar. Scale corrects error. Once again, the army advanced into silence. Once again, cities surrendered without resistance. Once again, victory arrived early and proved meaningless. This time, the counterattack was deliberate. As disease spread and morale thinned, the defenders struck supply convoys, ambushed detachments, and vanished before retaliation could organize. The war refused to stabilize into something recognizable. There were no decisive battles because there was no permission to have them. The conqueror blamed generals. He blamed terrain. He blamed treachery. He did not blame the assumption that every enemy wanted to be conquered visibly. The third invasion was an admission disguised as persistence. It was not sent to win. It was sent to force the issue, to compel a confrontation, to drag the enemy into the open where strength could finally speak its language. The enemy obliged, but only on its own terms. A river became the stage. Tides rose and fell with indifferent precision. The defenders prepared not banners, but carpentry. Stakes were driven into the riverbed at calculated angles, hidden beneath water that appeared deep and safe. It was a method borrowed from memory, refined by patience, the kind of tactic that only works if one understands time better than force. The fleet advanced with confidence. Ships moved upriver, following channels they assumed were navigable. At high tide, everything looked obedient. The water welcomed them. Then the tide turned. As the river drained itself, the illusion collapsed. Hulls shuddered and stopped. Iron scraped wood. Ships tilted, trapped and exposed. Panic replaced command. The defenders emerged at once, striking vessels that could not maneuver, burning those that could not escape. The river transformed from route to trap. It was not a battle. It was a demonstration. The steppe genius, perfected for open space, drowned in a narrow channel. Horses were useless, formations meaningless. The machine that relied on movement was immobilized by stillness. The water did not rage, it simply receded. By the time the survivors fled, the river was a graveyard. Masts jutted like accusations. Armor lay embedded in mud. The conqueror's confidence sank with the ships. This defeat was different. It could not be blamed on weather alone. It could not be explained as chance. It was strategy meeting environment and losing cleanly. The humiliation was total and undeniable. The conqueror had now been refused twice by nature and once by intelligence. The message was consistent. His empire excelled at overwhelming systems that shared its assumptions. It failed against those that refused the premise entirely. The psychological damage deepened. Generals grew cautious. Advisors whispered limits. The court began to understand that expansion southward was not just costly, it was counterproductive. Each failure drained prestige, resources, and belief. And yet from this series of humiliations emerged the empire's strangest success. Having failed to expand, it consolidated. Having failed to conquer environments, it connected them. The conqueror and his kin now controlled corridors rather than continents, routes rather than territories, movement rather than domination. The terror that once erased cities was repurposed to protect roads. Relay stations appeared across vast distances. Passports replaced threats. Merchants traveled where armies had stalled. Ideas moved faster than soldiers ever had. This was not intentional benevolence. It was adaptation through disappointment. The empire learned that it could not rule everything, but it could link almost anything. By abandoning the fantasy of universal conquest, it accidentally created a world that talked to itself. Trade flourished. Knowledge migrated. Technology slipped across borders under the protection of fear. The conqueror became less a destroyer and more an enabler, though he would never have used the word. His failures forced him to discover a different kind of power, one that did not require annihilation. But this adaptation carried its own poison. The empire that connected the world did not integrate it. It moved value without embedding loyalty. It enriched intermediaries and alienated producers. The jungle and the river had taught humility. The bureaucracy would forget the lesson. The defeats in the South lingered in memory not as warnings, but as resentments. They sharpened suspicion toward environments and peoples that did not conform. They encouraged reliance on outsiders to manage complexity. They deepened the divide between rulers and ruled. The jungle had done more than repel invasion. It had exposed the empire's blind spot. Power that assumes compliance will always misread refusal. Strength that depends on motion will fail where stillness decides outcomes. The conqueror turned away from the South, not because he was satisfied, but because he was forced. His empire adjusted, but it did not heal. The lessons of water and wood would echo later, when floods replaced rivers and peasants replaced jungles. The stakes that destroyed the fleet did more than pierce hulls. They punctured the myth that scale guarantees success. They proved that intelligence paired with patience can humiliate brute efficiency. The jungle did not defeat the empire, it educated it. And like all lessons learned late, the education came at a cost that would be paid by successors who did not understand where the weakness had been revealed. The river flowed on, indifferent. The empire moved elsewhere, chastened but unbroken, for now. Peace arrived the way it always does in empires born of violence, not as mercy, but as exhaustion that learned how to monetize itself. After the failures at sea and in jungle rivers, expansion lost its urgency. The borders stopped moving, not because ambition had died, but because it had met friction expensive enough to command respect. The conquerors discovered something unintuitive. When an empire stops conquering, it does not stop exerting power. It simply redirects it. The blade turns sideways and becomes a road. The terror that once erased cities was repurposed into guarantee. The same reputation that made walls open without a fight now made caravans travel without escorts. Fear became infrastructure, not the crude fear of massacre, but the refined fear of consequence. To rob a merchant under this regime was not a crime. It was a misunderstanding with the state. And the state specialized in clarifying misunderstandings permanently. Across the continent, relay stations appeared with mechanical regularity. Horses rested where horses had never rested. Couriers replaced raiders. Orders moved faster than rumor. The empire built a nervous system before it built a conscience. Messages leapt across distances that had once taken seasons to cross. Time itself was compressed into something manageable. To carry authority across this network, the conquerors invented a simple object with terrifying implications. A tablet, a token, proof that the bearer moved under imperial protection. With it, a traveler could requisition horses, food, shelter. Without it, he was invisible. The passport was not paperwork. It was a moving boundary. Where it went, the empire went. Merchants noticed first. They are trained to sense opportunity before permission is granted. A Venetian could leave the edge of Europe and arrive in the eastern capital without negotiating dozens of local tyrants. A Persian astronomer could travel east without hiring an army. A missionary could wander into lands that had previously been stories. The roads were open because no one dared close them. This was not peace in the moral sense. It was silence enforced at scale. Local wars still existed. Bandits still breathed. But above them hovered an authority uninterested in nuance. Disrupt the flow, and you became an example. Most chose cooperation. What moved along these highways was not just silk and spices. Ideas slipped through quietly. disguised as cargo. Printing methods traveled west. Gunpowder followed, misinterpreted at first as novelty before becoming obsession. The compass wandered into unfamiliar hands. Paper money crossed borders, stripped of context, but full of promise. The world began to synchronize without asking permission. In the opposite direction came numbers, star charts, medical texts, artistic styles. Knowledge that had been trapped in one language found new mouths. This exchange was not curated, it was accidental. The empire did not set out to educate the world. It set out to stabilize it enough to extract value. Education was a side effect. The capital transformed into a market of accents. Advisors spoke in borrowed tongues. Accountants calculated in systems foreign to the land they administered. The court became cosmopolitan, not by choice but by necessity. The conquerors trusted outsiders more than the conquered. Foreigners had no local loyalties. Their dependence was clean. This was the paradox of the peace. The safer the roads became, the less integrated the empire felt internally. Trade flourished while trust withered. The highways connected continents but bypassed communities. Wealth moved upward and outward. Production remained local. Resentment fermented quietly at the bottom. The empire mistook motion for harmony. From a distance, the system looked miraculous. Never before had so much of the known world been stitched together by a single authority. Travel narratives read like fantasy. Cities glimmered with foreign goods. Courts boasted of their reach. The empire had done what no philosophy had achieved. It had made geography obedient. Up close, the picture was less flattering. The peace was thin. It relied on constant surveillance and immediate punishment. Local administration was outsourced to intermediaries who understood profit better than people. The conquerors, warriors by training, despised the tedium of management. They delegated it to those who would do it without asking questions. These managers were efficient and predatory. They optimized extraction. They learned how much pressure could be applied before revolt. They skimmed generously. The court noticed the revenue and ignored the method. Peace, after all, was expensive. As trade intensified, inequality sharpened. Merchants grew wealthy. Middlemen thrived. Those who produced grain, silk, and labor saw little change except heavier accounting. The highways carried luxury past villages that were forbidden to participate fully. The empire was open to the world and closed to its own foundation. Still, the roads held. The conquerors congratulated themselves on having solved governance through movement. If goods flowed, if messages arrived, if tribute was delivered, order must exist. They equated circulation with stability. It was an understandable mistake. Motion feels like life. Stillness feels like decay. But systems built on circulation require maintenance. Roads crack, stations rot, horses die, officials steal. Over time, the cost of keeping everything moving rises. The terror that once enforced compliance grows dull with familiarity. Fear must be refreshed. Refreshing fear is expensive. The peace depended on the credibility of punishment. As long as retribution was swift and certain, compliance remained rational. As soon as that certainty wavered, the calculation changed. Bandits tested routes. Local powers tested patience. The empire responded, but slower than before. Distance, once conquered, began to reassert itself. The irony deepened. The highways had made the empire legible to itself. Information flowed upward as easily as goods. Problems could no longer hide. Every failure was visible. Every delay was recorded. The scale that once amplified power now amplified weakness. And beneath it all sat the unresolved contradiction. The empire had built global connection without building local consent. It had created routes for strangers while segregating subjects. It had chosen efficiency over belonging. The peace was real, but it was not shared equally. This was the apex of the system. Terror stabilized into traffic. Conquest matured into coordination. The empire had become indispensable to the world it dominated. Removing it would tear networks apart. That dependence felt like security. It was not. Highways built from terror do not forgive neglect. They do not generate loyalty. They generate usage. When the terror fades, usage does not turn into affection. It turns into opportunism. The roads would remain valuable even after the authority that built them weakened. The empire had connected the world. It had not convinced the world to care if it survived. History registered the achievement with its usual indifference. An era of movement had been engineered out of fear. It would end the same way. For now the roads hummed. The caravans passed. The capital glittered. The conquerors believed they had discovered a higher form of rule. They had built highways from terror and called it peace. Every empire eventually reveals who it is afraid of, not in speeches, in spreadsheets. Once conquest slowed and highways replaced battlefields, the rulers faced a problem they had spent generations avoiding. They did not trust the people who actually lived on the land they ruled. Trust, after all, implies vulnerability, and vulnerability was not a step virtue. So the solution was not integration. It was architecture, social architecture, a pyramid built not to uplift but to isolate. At the top sat the conquerors themselves, few in number, heavy with privilege, light on responsibility. They were exempt from much of the labor that sustained the realm. They commanded armies, held titles, and lived at a distance from the consequences of policy. Below them sat a carefully selected buffer, outsiders imported precisely because they did not belong. Foreigners with no ancestral graves to defend, no local networks to betray them, no claim to legitimacy beyond usefulness. They were perfect instruments. Below them came those considered manageable. People long accustomed to being ruled by others, permitted to administer small matters but excluded from real power. And at the bottom, compressed beneath every expectation and every burden, were those whose numbers terrified the court. The majority, the producers, the culturally confident, the last to be conquered, and therefore the least trusted. This was not social order. It was risk management. By law, custom, and habit, the empire segmented itself into suspicion zones. Access to office, justice, and protection followed the hierarchy. Punishments escalated as status declined. Mobility froze. The system was not subtle. It was meant to be felt daily. A constant reminder that power did not rest on consent. It rested on classification. The genius of the design was its cruelty. The rulers did not need to oppress everyone directly. They outsourced the work. The foreign intermediaries collected taxes, enforced regulations, and absorbed public hatred. When resentment flared, it flared at managers with strange accents and unfamiliar faces. The throne remained distant, insulated by layers of administrative blame. For a time, this worked brilliantly. Revenue flowed. Order appeared stable. The court enjoyed the illusion of control without the inconvenience of engagement. Warriors remained warriors. Administrators remained disposable. The conquered remained productive. But systems built on delegation rot from the middle. The intermediaries were efficient because efficiency paid. They understood accounting, logistics, and leverage. They also understood opportunity. Their loyalty was not ideological, it was contractual. As long as profit exceeded risk, they served faithfully. When extraction intensified, they intensified with it. The court noticed the gold and ignored the method. The method was predation. Tax collection transformed into bidding wars. Provinces were leased like assets. Whoever promised the largest return was granted authority with minimal oversight. How the money was raised was not the state's concern. Results mattered. Process did not. This was governance stripped to its balance sheet. Predictably, extraction escalated. Taxes were collected in advance. Fees multiplied. Permits were invented to monetize existence itself. The countryside learned that survival now required accounting skills it did not possess. Farmers paid to cross bridges their ancestors had built. Merchants paid to sell goods already taxed. Entire regions bled quietly, while reports in the capital remained reassuringly positive. The rulers congratulated themselves on innovation. When the countryside could no longer be squeezed fast enough, the financiers offered a solution so elegant it felt like magic. Paper. It was not a new invention. It had existed before, tethered carefully to reserves and trust. But in the hands of conquerors accustomed to tangible wealth, it became something else. The note was mistaken for the thing it represented. Value was confused with authority. If the state declared the paper valuable, then it must be. If supplies ran low, more paper could be made. Scarcity solved. At first, it felt miraculous. Debts vanished. Salaries were paid. Projects resumed. The court basked in the glow of liquidity, without noticing the temperature rising beneath it. Then prices moved. Slowly. Then faster. Grain demanded stacks of notes. Wages lost meaning between paydays. Markets seized as trust evaporated. Soldiers paid in paper discovered it could not be eaten. Merchants refused it or demanded obscene quantities. The countryside, already hollowed by extraction, collapsed into barter and hoarding. The court responded the only way it knew how. It printed more. This was not incompetence. It was consistency. A regime that solved problems through assertion assumed assertion would solve value. It did not understand that money is a promise, not a command. Promises require belief. Belief had been drained by classification, predation, and distance. Inflation did not feel like a policy failure at the top. It felt like noise. The palaces remained stocked. Rituals continued. Officials blamed local corruption. Local officials blamed the weather. The system blamed everyone except itself. What had once been a terror, stabilized into traffic, now destabilized into farce. The highways still functioned, but fewer goods traveled them. The relay stations still stood, but trust no longer moved at the same speed. The empire's connective tissue thinned. The social pyramid, designed to prevent unity, achieved its purpose too well. The majority had every incentive to see the system fail. They shared humiliation daily. They shared hunger increasingly. What they lacked was coordination. The court mistook silence for acceptance. It mistook obedience for loyalty. It mistook accounting for governance. And then nature intervened. Rivers shifted. Floods erased harvests. Famine followed paperwork. The response was administrative brilliance bordering on insanity. Massive labor projects were announced to correct the disasters. Hundreds of thousands were conscripted. The already starving were given shovels and deadlines. Overseers were appointed from the same intermediary class that had drained them dry. The result was not relief. It was concentration. Anger, hunger, and humiliation were gathered into the same camps, the same riverbanks, the same mud. People who had suffered separately now suffered together. They compared stories. They discovered patterns. They realized their misery was not accidental. It was systematic. The rulers remained distant. They debated reforms. They adjusted ceremonies. They replaced officials without changing incentives. They printed edicts with the same enthusiasm they printed money. By the time the court sensed danger, it misidentified its source. It expected bandits. It expected rival elites. It did not expect belief. Belief moves faster than armies. Belief does not require supply lines. Belief thrives on injustice, and belief had found fertile ground in a society designed to divide but forced by catastrophe to assemble. The four classes had prevented rebellion by design. Outsourcing had prevented accountability. Paper had postponed collapse. Together, they created something far more dangerous than invasion. They created unanimity at the bottom. The empire had optimized itself for extraction and control. It had forgotten persuasion. It had confused management with rule. It had treated people as inputs and learned too late that inputs remember. The lies printed on paper were easier to burn than iron. And when they burned, they illuminated a truth the court could no longer obscure. Heaven does not revoke mandates with announcements. It does so by making obedience irrational. The system had reached that point. Rivers do not rebel, they testify. For centuries, this river had carried grain, taxes, corpses, and legitimacy in equal measure. It had been praised when it fed cities and cursed when it drowned them. Engineers argued with it. Priests negotiated with it. Emperors claimed to command it. The river listened to none of them. It waited. When it finally moved, it did not flood politely. It changed its mind. The channel tore itself from its banks and rewrote the map with liquid indifference. Fields vanished. Villages dissolved. Granaries turned into ponds. Millions were displaced in a season, and the heartland that fed the empire became an accusation too large to ignore. To the people, this was not weather. This was a verdict. Heaven had not whispered. It had slammed the table. The court responded with confidence unburdened by empathy. A grand project was announced. The river would be forced back into obedience. Dikes would be rebuilt. Channels recut. Order would be restored by decree and manpower. Hundreds of thousands were conscripted. The starving were assembled. The dispossessed were given tools instead of food and told to be grateful for purpose. It was a masterclass in miscalculation. These labor camps became crucibles. Hunger, exhaustion, and injustice concentrated into shared experience. Men who had once suffered in isolation now stood shoulder to shoulder in mud, beaten by overseers who spoke with foreign accents and carried ledgers thicker than their whips. Grain meant to feed them was stolen. Wages were paid in paper that dissolved into mockery. The river did not kill them. Administration did. Something old woke up in that mud. Not strategy, not politics. Belief. Rumors spread faster than orders ever had. Stories of a world ending, of darkness finally named, of salvation arriving on schedule. The language was religious because religion compresses rage into meaning. Secret societies stepped into the vacuum left by credibility. They offered coherence where the state offered paperwork. The slogans were simple, elegant, impossible to negotiate with. The empire is in chaos. Expel the rulers. Restore the people. The court heard noise and looked for bandits. It did not understand it was facing theology, weaponized by hunger. Armies were dispatched. They dispersed gatherings and executed leaders. Each execution multiplied the idea. Martyrs are cheaper than soldiers. Out of this movement emerged many men who wanted to be kings. Most failed quickly. Charisma without logistics collapses fast. Prophecy without discipline burns out. The rebellion devoured its own theatrics and searched for something colder. It found it in a man who had learned early that survival requires neither purity nor hope, only structure. He came from the bottom layer of the empire's design, a nobody by law, a nobody by birth, orphaned by famine, reduced to begging, sheltered briefly by religion, not for faith, but for food. He understood desperation intimately. He did not romanticize it, he organized it. While others preached apocalypse, he drilled men. While others announced destiny, he secured supply lines. While others declared themselves divine, he enforced discipline. He punished looters. He protected farmers. He paid troops with real grain. He understood something the empire had forgotten. People follow systems that work. His rise was not meteoric, it was methodical. Rivals were absorbed or eliminated. Cities fell not through terror, but through relief. He did not promise a new heaven. He promised an end to humiliation. That was enough. The empire, hollowed out by decades of outsourced rule, could not respond coherently. Its generals were corrupt, its soldiers unpaid, its court consumed by ritual and suspicion. The terror that had once paralyzed continents now arrived late, underfunded and unconvinced of itself. As the rebel armies moved north, resistance thinned. Gates opened, officials defected. Peasants guided troops through routes no map recorded. The highways that once carried imperial power now carried its replacement. Infrastructure does not choose sides. It serves whoever arrives prepared. The final act was almost quiet. The capital still stood. Palaces still glittered. Clocks still ticked in ornate chambers. The emperor remained absorbed in private obsessions, surrounded by devices that moved beautifully, while the world outside stopped functioning. When reports arrived, they were filtered, delayed, softened. Reality reached the throne only after it had passed by. There was no heroic siege, no last stand, no speech for history to admire. When the rebel army approached, the court did what it had been trained to do for generations. It fled. The northern gates opened. The ruler gathered his household, his treasures, his symbols, and retreated toward the grasslands that had birthed his ancestors. The circle closed with embarrassing precision, from step to throne and back to step, all within a human lifetime. The dynasty ended the way it had governed, by leaving someone else to deal with the consequences. In the capital, banners were replaced, calendars reset again. A new name was announced: bright, pure, corrective. It positioned itself not as innovation, but as restoration. The rebellion crowned itself a dynasty and called the past century an interruption. History, as always, declined to argue. The new rulers dismantled the old classifications with public enthusiasm. Foreign managers were purged. Paper money was restrained. Rituals were simplified. National memory was sharpened into warning. The lesson was taught relentlessly. Never again allow outsiders to rule without becoming us. Never again separate power from the people it feeds on. Yet the legacy of the fallen regime refused to vanish. The roads remained. The maps endured. The idea that China was part of a wider world could not be unlearned. Technologies exchanged during the Great Peace did not return to their origins. The trauma lingered as nationalism. The connectivity lingered as opportunity. The dynasty that fell had failed to transform conquest into belonging. It had connected the world while alienating its base. It had ruled through fear, classification, and accounting. It had confused motion with legitimacy and legitimacy with costume. Its rise proved that military genius can shatter civilizations. Its fall proved that management without trust cannot survive stillness. The verdict was complete. The river had spoken. The people had answered. Heaven had moved on. History closed the ledger without sentiment. The experiment in foreign rule had ended not because it was brief or brutal, but because it misunderstood the only resource that cannot be printed, outsourced, or terrorized into existence: consent. Empires may conquer states. They do not conquer cultures. Those who forget this rule always learn it the same way. Too late.